A black doctor boards a flight with her son, but one question from a passenger changes everything. Dr. Angela Brown was just trying to get home. After months of long shifts and late nights at the hospital, this flight was supposed to be simple, just her and her son Michael, heading to visit family. But the moment they stepped into first class, everything shifted. A fellow passenger made an assumption he thought was harmless. But 7 minutes later, as the plane descended, his entire perspective had changed. What happened next left the entire cabin in silence. This isn't just a story about a flight. It's about the quiet weight of prejudice and the unexpected way it unravels. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if this resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal the truth hiding in plain sight. The airport terminal, with its polished floors and restless murmurs, felt no different from the countless others Angela Brown had passed through. The ceiling stretched wide, arching over travelers who moved with the familiar choreography of boarding passes and briefcases, their lives temporarily suspended between destinations. Angela walked with quiet precision, her son Michael trailing beside her, his small hand tucked into hers. He was 6, full of the kind of questions that come with innocence, the ones that assume the world is fair until it proves otherwise. Mom, do pilots ever get lost in the sky? Michael looked up at her, his eyes wide with curiosity. Angela smiled softly. Not with the right training, she replied. She could feel the weight of the bag on her shoulder. But more than that, she felt the weight of the eyes. Not in the direct way people stare when something surprises them, no. This was more subtle. A glance held a second too long. A flicker of curiosity that didn't quite vanish when caught. It wasn't new. Angela had learned to exist in these spaces, the quiet corridors of airports, hospitals, conference rooms, without disturbing the order people expected. She wasn't loud. She didn't have to be. Her very presence was enough to shift the atmosphere, even when no one said it aloud. Michael tugged on her sleeve. I see our gate, Mom, he said, pointing. Gate 17A. Good eye, she replied, guiding him through the crowd. The first-class line was shorter. But as Angela approached, she felt the faintest resistance in the air, like stepping into a room where the temperature shifts. Subtle but undeniable. The attendant at the counter greeted the man in front of her warmly. A quick exchange, a scan of his ticket, and he was on his way. When Angela stepped forward, the woman's eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly. First class? She asked. Angela met her gaze evenly. That's right, she said, handing over the tickets. Michael clung to her side, distracted by the spinning wheels of his carry-on. The attendant studied the tickets a moment longer than necessary, then smiled, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Enjoy your flight, she said, waving them through. Angela nodded, leading Michael toward the gate. She could feel it beginning, the soft unraveling that often accompanied moments like these. The assumptions, stitched quietly beneath the surface of polite smiles and professional tone. It wasn't hostility. It was doubt. The kind that never needed words to be understood. As they waited to board, Michael leaned against her leg, his head resting comfortably. Angela stroked his hair, her fingers weaving through curls that matched her own. Nearby, a man glanced over, middle-aged, salt and pepper hair, wearing the kind of tailored suit that suggested influence. His gaze lingered on them, drifting between Angela's face and Michael's. When their eyes met, he offered a polite nod. But there was a question in the tilt of his head, one Angela recognized too well. It was not curiosity about where she was going. It was curiosity about how she got here. Angela returned the nod, but nothing more. In Michael's small world, these moments were invisible. But Angela knew, one day, they wouldn't be. That was the part that tired her the most. Mom, Michael whispered, tugging her hand again. Are we going to be first on the plane? Angela smiled down at him. Almost. The gate attendant began calling for first-class boarding, and Angela rose, gathering their bags. As she approached, she caught a fleeting glance from a flight attendant standing nearby. A flicker of hesitation that passed as quickly as it came. Angela said nothing. She didn't need to. She had spent years watching people measure her without ever lifting a scale. The first-class cabin was half empty, but the space still felt tight in ways Angela Brown couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the seat or the overhead bin. It was something less tangible. Something woven into the quiet glances and the small pauses that stretched longer than necessary. Michael climbed into the window seat, pressing his palms to the glass with the kind of wonder only a child could have. "We're so high already," he whispered, even though the plane was still at the gate. Angela smiled, tucking their bags into the compartment above. She could feel the weight of someone watching, though no one said a word. Across the aisle sat the same man from the gate, the one with the sharp suit and the quiet questions in his eyes. He wasn't staring, but he wasn't exactly looking away either. Angela met his gaze for a moment, letting him see the quiet confidence in her eyes. "I know you're wondering. I'm used to it. But the thing about moments like this was that they didn't dissolve with eye contact. They lingered, curling in the corners of the room, waiting for an opportunity to make themselves known." The flight attendant approached, all professional warmth and trained smiles. She leaned down to Michael first, her voice soft and practiced. "Would you like some juice, sweetheart?" Michael grinned. "Apple, please." Angela watched the exchange, grateful for the brief reprieve of normalcy. But the reprieve didn't last long. The flight attendant straightened and turned to Angela, her smile still polite but her eyes uncertain. "And for you, miss?" "It was a small thing, miss." Angela caught it immediately. "Water, thank you," she replied, watching the attendant carefully. The woman hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze flicking back to Michael. Angela could feel it, that tiny seed of doubt sprouting into something more. "Ma'am," the attendant began, lowering her voice slightly, "I just wanted to confirm." Angela's hand tightened on the armrest. "Here it comes. Is this your seat?" Angela's gaze didn't waver. "It is." The flight attendant smiled again, though this time it felt thinner. "Of course. Just making sure." Angela could feel the man across the aisle shift slightly, his attention sharpening. She had been here before. In restaurants, in hotel lobbies, in the hallways of the hospital where she wore her white coat like armor. It was never the words themselves. It was the implication that followed them. "You must be out of place." Angela didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or ask to speak to a supervisor. She let the silence hang there, heavy and unyielding. "Thank you," Angela said calmly, taking the glass of water as the flight attendant retreated down the aisle. Michael sipped his apple juice, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. "Mom," he whispered, pointing to the clouds. "Look, they're like big pillows." Angela smiled softly, brushing a hand through his curls. "They are," she said, but her gaze drifted beyond the window, settling on the reflection of the man across the aisle. He was still watching. She let him look, let him wonder, and then, she turned back to Michael, anchoring herself in the one truth that mattered: she belonged here. No matter who doubted it. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin like distant thunder. Angela Brown felt the rhythm of the aircraft beneath her feet, steady and unchanging. But outside the glass, the morning light stretched thin across the tarmac, and Angela could feel something else pressing down a weight that didn't belong to the plane. Michael leaned into her side, kicking his feet softly against the seat. His excitement pulsed gently through the armrest, as if he could barely contain the thrill of being in the sky. But Angela's focus lingered on the quiet figures around her. The man across the aisle again had shifted in his seat. He wasn't watching them now. Not directly, but she could tell by the way he held his phone, his thumb scrolling without urgency, that his attention was divided. His gaze flicked up when he thought she wouldn't notice. Quick and measured, she noticed. Angela had long accepted that people often weighed her existence like they weighed their carry-ons. Careful not to show too much discomfort, but aware of the extra weight she seemed to bring into the room. Michael tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, when we take off, do we go faster than cars?" Angela smiled, brushing his curls from his forehead. "Much faster," she said. The flight attendant from earlier reappeared at the front of the cabin. She didn't approach this time, but Angela caught the way her eyes darted toward their row as she handed drinks to another passenger. It wasn't the attention that bothered Angela. It was the timing. Because twice was not an accident. The plane inched closer to the runway. Angela adjusted the buckle on Michael's seatbelt. Her fingers steady, but her mind still circling the interaction. She thought about the patients she had cared for and how they looked at her sometimes, wide-eyed with disbelief when she introduced herself as the lead surgeon. She thought about the conferences where she had stood at podiums, explaining procedures to men who nodded politely, but asked the same questions twice as if to verify she knew what she was talking about. She thought about the slow drip of doubt that followed her everywhere. Like a leak in the ceiling that no one could find but everyone pretended not to hear. And here it was, in first class, wrapped in the thin veil of professional politeness. Angela sighed quietly, watching the flight attendant glide down the aisle. She wasn't angry. She was tired. Tired in the way people become when the weight of explaining themselves sits too long in their chest. Michael didn't notice. And maybe that was the part Angela guarded most fiercely, this thin veil of innocence that still protected him. For now, he saw clouds and juice boxes. He didn't see the pauses. But one day he would. One day, he would notice how the world made his mother explain herself without asking. The plane roared as it lifted from the ground, tilting toward the sky. Angela leaned back into her seat, feeling the pressure press them both into their chairs. Michael giggled. It feels funny. Angela squeezed his hand, grateful for the distraction. Across the aisle, the man in the suit watched the clouds rise beneath them. And Angela wondered if he felt the turbulence too. The plane had reached its cruising altitude. But the cabin felt heavier than before. It wasn't the weight of the aircraft or the pressure of the sky pressing against the windows. It was something subtler, something that didn't shift with the altitude. Angela Brown sat quietly, one hand resting on Michael's shoulder as he drifted in and out of sleep. His head tilted against the window. His breath was soft, his curls forming small halos in the dim cabin light. She should have felt peace at this moment. Instead, she felt watched. The man across the aisle hadn't said a word to her since his polite misstep at the gate. But silence, Angela knew, was rarely empty. Sometimes silence was a question that refused to be asked aloud. And she had learned long ago that it was not always the loud voices you had to answer. Sometimes, it was the quiet ones that lingered longest. Angela shifted slightly, crossing one leg over the other. She caught the faintest flicker of movement from the man's direction, the way his eyes moved just a second too late. Like he'd been staring and hoped she wouldn't notice. He wasn't angry, he wasn't rude, but there was a question hanging in the air. And she could feel it pressing against her like the armrest between them. It was always the same question. How did you get here? Angela smoothed a hand over Michael's blanket, adjusting it unnecessarily. She had long since stopped searching for anger in these moments. The truth was, anger rarely had a place to land in rooms like this. Instead, there was the quiet rehearsal of answers she didn't owe anyone but often found herself giving anyway. She thought about speaking. About softening the tension with the kind of small talk that reassured people. Something light, something easy. But why should she? Angela had spent years performing that quiet dance, folding herself into neat edges to make others comfortable. And the truth was, no matter how carefully she moved, the dance never ended. The hum of the engines filled the space between them. A flight attendant passed by, pausing to refill the man's glass. Anything for you, ma'am? She asked, her voice even but distant. The way people sound when they're not fully sure how to place you. Angela shook her head. I'm fine, thank you. The man across the aisle glanced at her again, this time under the guise of shifting in his seat. Angela met his gaze directly. It was brief, a flash of eye contact that held just long enough to make the silence louder. But in that moment, Angela saw something else: uncertainty. Not hostility. Not malice. Just uncertainty. And there it was, the contradiction that followed her everywhere. People didn't always know they were questioning her. Sometimes the doubt was so polite, so soft-spoken, that even the person holding it didn't recognize the weight of what they carried. Angela let the moment pass without speaking. Not because she was afraid to speak, but because the silence said enough. Michael shifted in his sleep, mumbling something about superheroes. Angela leaned back, watching the sky stretch wide outside the window. The plane soared forward, but inside the cabin, the smallest distances still felt like miles. The soft murmur of conversation drifted through the first-class cabin, the clinking of ice and low hum of the engines forming a familiar backdrop. Angela Brown sat still, her hand resting lightly on Michael's shoulder as he slept. His small body curled comfortably beneath the thin airline blanket. Across the aisle, the man in the suit shifted again. It was small, just the adjustment of his cufflink. The tapping of his thumb against his knee, but Angela recognized it for what it was. Restlessness. Not the kind that came from long flights or stiff seats, but the restlessness of someone searching for resolution to an unspoken question. Angela had seen it before. In hospital corridors where patients hesitated before asking if she was the surgeon. In restaurants where servers glanced twice at the bill before placing it in her hand. In the eyes of men like the one across the aisle, who weren't entirely sure what unsettled them. Only that something didn't sit right. Angela could feel his curiosity pressing against the quiet like a held breath. She thought of saying something. There were words she could use. Phrases honed over years of careful interactions that would smooth the sharp edges of the moment. She could offer him a polite smile. Make herself smaller. Reassure him without acknowledging the thing that hovered between them. But she was tired of folding herself into the shape of other people's comfort. Instead, she let the silence linger. Let him sit with his uncertainty the way she had learned to sit with hers. The flight attendant returned, pausing near Angela's row with a gentle smile. "Would you like anything, Dr. Brown?" Angela looked up, meeting the woman's gaze. The weight of the title, spoken aloud, shifted the air like the first crack of thunder before rain. Across the aisle, the man stilled. Angela could feel his attention sharpen. His thumb no longer tapping. He wasn't staring. Not exactly. But he was listening now. Listening in a way that carried the quiet unraveling of an assumption. Angela let it hang there. Her answer slow and deliberate. "No, thank you," she replied, smoothing the blanket over Michael's shoulder. The attendant nodded and moved down the aisle, leaving the silence heavier than before. The man's eyes flicked toward her again. Just briefly. Angela knew what he was seeing now was the same woman. The same child, but through a different lens. The shape of his doubt had shifted. But it hadn't disappeared. Because that's how doubt worked. It didn't dissolve in an instant. It lingered. It was reformed. Angela glanced at Michael, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest as he slept. He didn't see the small battles she fought in rooms like this. But one day, he would. And when that day came, Angela hoped he would understand that his mother's silence wasn't submission. It was resistance. Resistance to the quiet weight of assumptions that asked her to explain herself. To make sense of her presence in spaces where her existence alone should have been enough. The man across the aisle shifted again. This time with the quiet discomfort of someone who had learned something they weren't sure they were ready to know. Angela let him hold that. Let him wrestle with the space between what he expected and what was real. Because sometimes, the lesson wasn't in the explanation. It was in the silence that followed. The plane cruised steady, a thread of silver slicing through the sky. Outside, clouds stretched endlessly, indifferent to the quiet turbulence that stirred below the surface of the cabin. Angela Brown felt it. It wasn't loud, but neither was the kind of mistrust she knew too well. It rarely announced itself. More often, it slid into the room quietly, wrapped in the language of politeness, in the weight of glances held just long enough to be noticed. Michael stirred beside her, rubbing his eyes as he woke. His small fingers found hers. And Angela held them, her grip gentle but firm. "Are we there yet?" Michael's voice was soft, thick with sleep. "Not yet," Angela replied, brushing a curl from his forehead. "Almost." Across the aisle, the man in the suit she thought of as the watcher now folded his newspaper, smoothing the creases carefully as if ordering the world beneath his fingertips. Angela felt his gaze skim them again. She wasn't angry. There was no point in anger. Anger exhausted itself on things that didn't bend. And Angela knew men like him didn't often bend. They adjusted. They reconsidered. But they rarely admitted aloud the shift happening within them. The watcher cleared his throat. And Angela braced for the inevitable. "Excuse me." he began, his voice wrapped in the soft veneer of politeness that could just as easily mask curiosity as condescension. Angela turned to him slowly, offering the smallest of smiles, the kind meant to acknowledge someone without inviting them in. Yes? I couldn't help but notice. He started, gesturing vaguely between her and Michael, though he hadn't yet settled on the right words. Your son. He's a bright kid. Angela nodded. He is. And, he continued, still searching for his footing. I assume you travel often? It wasn't the question he wanted to ask. Angela had long learned to listen beneath the words, to the unspoken inquiry carried between the lines. How did you afford first class? Where is his father? Are you sure you belong here? The words rarely came that plainly, but the meaning remained. Angela looked at him carefully. Yes, she said. We do. The watcher hesitated, as if weighing the response. His eyes flicked briefly to Michael, who now leaned sleepily against the window, tracing shapes against the glass. Angela wondered if he saw it the way Michael's features mirrored her own. Perhaps, Angela thought, that was the real question lingering in his mind. Why did it take me so long to notice? The watcher shifted again, crossing one leg over the other. The polite smile he wore grew tighter, as if held in place by the discomfort of what hadn't been said. Angela could have left it there. She could have let him sit with the silence. Let him carry his questions off the plane and back into his world where they might shrink beneath more pressing matters. But Michael was watching now, his sleepy eyes flickering between them. And Angela understood that this moment was not just hers. Dr. Brown, Angela said, gently correcting him. The watcher blinked. I'm sorry? My name, she repeated, her voice soft but unyielding. Dr. Angela Brown. She let the title hang there long enough to settle. And there it was. The watcher straightened slightly, his lips parting just enough to suggest surprise. It was the same expression Angela had seen on patients' faces when she entered the room when they expected someone else and got her instead. I see, he replied, offering a slight nod. Dr. Brown. His voice carried something different now, not quite apology, but acknowledgment. Angela accepted it for what it was. Across the cabin, the flight attendant passed by, pausing briefly to refill Angela's water. Everything all right? The attendant asked, though Angela caught the quiet flicker of understanding in her eyes. Angela smiled. Everything's fine. The watcher leaned back in his seat, unfolding his newspaper once more, though his eyes lingered on the same page without reading. Angela turned to Michael, tucking the blanket tighter around him. He smiled up at her sleepily. You're really smart, right, Mom? Angela kissed his forehead gently. I try to be, she said. Outside, the clouds parted briefly, and sunlight streamed through the window, settling over both of them like quiet recognition. The plane began its descent, tilting slightly as it sliced through the late afternoon sky. The shift in altitude was subtle, but Angela Brown felt it not just in the slight tug of gravity, but in the atmosphere of the cabin itself. Michael, now wide awake, pressed his forehead against the window, leaving small prints of breath on the glass as he counted clouds. Angela let him be, her gaze drifting across the aisle where the watcher sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap. He hadn't looked their way since their last exchange, but something lingered between them, quiet yet weighty, like the echo of footsteps in an empty hall. Angela wondered how many moments like this he had encountered in his life. Small collisions that forced him to confront what he thought he knew about people like her. She wondered, too, how many he had forgotten. Because that was the difference. For Angela, these moments were not easily discarded. They stitched themselves into the fabric of her day, folded neatly between her victories and setbacks. They lived quietly beneath the surface, shaping the way she moved through the world. But for him, perhaps this was just another fleeting exchange. The watcher shifted slightly, unfolding his hands to adjust his cufflink. It was a small gesture, but Angela recognized the unconscious need to do something when words fail. And still, neither of them spoke. It wasn't that he feared her presence. It was that he questioned it. And maybe, Angela thought, that was the part that hurt more, the quiet disbelief that someone like her could occupy this space without explanation. Michael tugged at her sleeve. Mom, can I get a snack when we land? Angela smiled softly. Of course. Her voice carried easily in the quiet cabin. And though it was meant for Michael, she could feel the watcher listening. It was often like this. The simplest things, her voice, her posture, the soft confidence with which she carried herself became declarations in rooms where her existence felt quietly scrutinized. Angela smoothed the wrinkles from her slacks, adjusting her seatbelt as the plane dipped lower. The runway stretched out ahead, long and inevitable, and in that descent, she felt the familiar pull of returning to a world that would ask her to explain herself again and again. But today, she would not explain. She would let him wonder. Because some lessons weren't meant to be handed over so easily. Sometimes, the silence had to do the teaching. Chapter 8. The Descent of Certainty. The plane dipped lower, slicing through layers of clouds as the city lights below flickered to life. The hum of the engines softened, and with it, the murmurs of passengers returning to themselves, checking their phones, gathering belongings, readying for the last stretch of the journey. Angela Brown sat quietly, her hand resting lightly on Michael's back as he pressed his face to the glass. Enchanted by the sprawl of the city beneath them. Across the aisle, the watcher had closed his newspaper, folding it neatly into thirds. His eyes lingered on the seat back in front of him. But his thoughts, Angela suspected, were elsewhere. He had not spoken since their last exchange. Angela hadn't expected him to. Because the weight of what passed between them could not be lifted by a few polite words. There was no grand confrontation. No raised voices. But that was the nature of these moments. The kind of moments that lived in the margins. The ones that made you question whether they had happened at all. Yet Angela felt it. It was as real as the ground rising beneath them. As real as the quiet tension that still clung to the watcher's shoulders. It was the small fracture of certainty. For a man like him, Angela suspected certainty had been a lifelong companion. The certainty that the world followed rules that bent in his favor. The certainty that people like Angela belonged in the background, not seated beside him at the front of the plane. But now, that certainty has shifted, if only slightly. Angela could see it in the way he avoided her gaze, not out of dismissal, but because he was recalibrating, reshaping his understanding of her in real time. And maybe that was enough. Not a revelation, but a fracture, a crack in the seamless glass through which he viewed the world. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the wheels skimming the runway before settling fully into the weight of the earth. Michael grinned, gripping his armrest. "We're here." Angela smiled, smoothing his hair. "Yes," she said, "we are." As the plane taxied toward the gate, Angela unbuckled their belts, gathering their bags with practiced ease. Michael bounced in his seat, already craning to spot the jet bridge through the window. The cabin lights brightened, passengers stood, stretching, shifting in the narrow aisles as they prepared to disembark. Angela rose slowly, adjusting Michael's small backpack over his shoulders. As she reached up to retrieve her carry-on, the watcher spoke. "Dr. Brown." His voice was quieter than before. Angela turned, meeting his gaze fully for the first time since their exchange. He hesitated, then extended his hand. "I misjudged," he said simply. There was no elaborate apology, no explanation, just those 3 words. Angela looked at his hand for a moment, then shook it firmly. "I know," she replied. And that was the truth of it. Angela had always known. The plane door opened, and passengers filtered out into the tunnel of the terminal. Michael tugged Angela's hand excitedly, leading her toward the exit. As they stepped onto solid ground, Angela felt lighter, not because the weight had disappeared, but because she had chosen not to carry all of it. Behind her, the watcher walked with his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly slumped, as though the cabin had been carrying something more than passengers. Angela hoped he would remember this flight. Not because she needed him to, but because the world shifted only when enough fractures appeared, when enough small cracks and certainty let the light through. And if this was one of those cracks, then maybe, just maybe, that was enough.